O children of God, how long will you remain at rest while the Holy Land cries out in agony? I have walked the streets of Jerusalem. I have seen the roads stained with the blood of pilgrims, our brothers beaten, humiliated upon the holiest ground of all. The house of God has been defiled, sacred places trampled by those who do not believe. And you still stand here as if it has nothing to do with you? That night, within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I knelt and God spoke to me. Rise, call upon all of Christendom, take up arms, and free Jerusalem from the hands of the infidel. Do you not see it? The plagues, the famine, the signs in the heavens. These are no accidents. They are God's warning. Come with me. Go to the land flowing with milk and honey. Go where your souls shall be saved.
After passing through Champagne in March 1096, Peter moved into Lorraine before remaining in Cologne during Easter. From there, he sent out small groups to preach in nearby towns, while gathering a force of around 15,000 people, men, women, and children alike. He was joined by several minor nobles, including Walter Sanzavoix, Reynold of Brives, Geoffrey of Burel, and others. The plan was simple: to follow the road to Jerusalem, the very path many Germans already knew from the Great Pilgrimage of 1064. Peter remained in Cologne to continue preaching and recruiting more German nobles. But Walter, impatient, chose to depart as soon as the Easter celebrations ended, taking several thousand followers with him. This division fractured the crusade into 5 separate groups, one led by Peter, one by Walter, and 3 others under various nobles who would twist the original message and turn it against the growing Jewish communities. The chain of events, now known as the Rhineland massacres, became a turning point in history. This was not the first time a minority had been attacked by the majority, but the scale and nature of these assaults marked a new chapter, setting a precedent that would echo through the centuries to come. Contemporary scholars often try to shift the blame onto Peter or the greed of the peasantry, seeking to distance the more successful Prince's Crusade from the chaos unleashed by the common people. Not necessarily because of the massacres themselves, but because many of those forcibly converted later returned to their old faith once the danger had passed. But how did all of this truly begin? And why did these groups start by targeting Jewish communities? Rumors had already spread among the ranks. Why should we travel to distant lands in the east to fight the enemies of God, when right before us stand the Jews, a people seen as his greatest enemies? With each passing day, children traveling with their parents kept asking if the next city would be Jerusalem, and the early excitement slowly gave way to impatience. At that time, while most German nobles were busy fighting among themselves, some were drawn in by the promise of forgiveness in exchange for military service. Count Amico of Leiningen pushed things even further. He carved a cross into his own flesh and proclaimed himself the last emperor, vowing to destroy the Jews before marching on Jerusalem. On the 3rd of May 1096, his well-armed and organized force unleashed a wave of violence in the newly settled city of Speyer, storming a Jewish synagogue. The Bishop of Speyer, having been warned in advance, did everything he could to protect the Jewish community. Thanks to his efforts, the number of victims was limited to 11. 15 days later, Amico marched on the city of Worms. According to the Mainz Chronicle, his followers carried with them a trampled corpse of one of their own buried some 30 days earlier, parading it through the streets and crying out, "Look what the Jews have done to our people. They took a Christian and boiled him in water, then poured that water into our wells to poison us." Forewarned by what had happened in Speyer, many Jews sought refuge under the protection of the Bishop of Worms. From within his palace, they watched as those who remained in their homes were slaughtered. The Crusaders demanded conversion. Those who accepted were spared, but most refused. Amico then laid siege to the bishop's residence. When his men finally broke in, they found that many of the Jews inside had chosen death over falling into their hands. Just 5 days later, the group arrived at Mainz, where once again the local archbishop accepted a large sum of money to shelter the Jewish community. At first, the townspeople stood with the Jews, but after 2 days of siege, some opened the gates, an act the Crusaders saw as divine intervention. "Look, the gates have opened on their own. It is the will of the crucified, so that we may avenge his blood upon the Jews." In a single day, 1,014 people were killed. When news of this reached Cologne, its people followed suit, massacring their own Jewish community and destroying every Torah scroll they could find. Meanwhile, other cities, like Regensburg, were spared, but only after mass forced conversions. A second group, led by a priest named Folkmar, moved through Bavaria toward Prague, inciting yet another massacre of Jews on June 1, while the Duke was absent. Another force, numbering at least 15,000 and led by Gottschalk, also left a trail of violence as it advanced along the Danube. It is important to note that many of these leaders would later join the Princess Crusade, and even within that officially recognized crusade, attacks on Jewish communities still occurred, showing that such violence was not limited to the so-called People's Movement alone. Those who joined this crusading movement came from every layer of society: peasants, townspeople, even knights. In what many saw as a chaotic march toward the Holy Land, the Jewish communities of the Rhineland became targets of crusading zeal. They were labeled as unbelievers within Christian lands and as sources of potential plunder. It is in this context that we hear the strange tale of the crusading goose. It is said that a woman led a goose, some even claim a goat, alongside the crusaders. People believed this was no ordinary animal, but a sign sent by God. And so, amid the crowd, it was allowed to lead the way, as if it knew the road to Jerusalem. But to those who still held on to reason, this was no miracle. It was a sign of a crowd losing its mind. And in the end, that prophetic goose never reached Jerusalem. Its journey ended on a dinner table. Yet contemporary chroniclers saw it very differently. Guibert of Nogent mocked such blind belief, treating the goose as a symbol of ignorance. Albert of Aachen went further. He saw the veneration of an animal as blasphemy, proof that people had lost both reason and dignity. To him, those who followed the goose were not worthy of being called crusaders. For Solomon Bar Simpson, a Jewish observer, the story carried a far darker meaning. It reflected a crowd swept up in fanaticism, where omens like the goose became justification for violence and massacre. Behind this strange tale lies a troubling truth. When faith abandons reason, it can turn even a religious movement into an uncontrollable frenzy. Returning to Peter's army, he set out in late April, marching toward Hungary. At first, everything went smoothly, until they reached the very city that the earlier French group had looted. A small dispute over nothing more than a pair of shoes erupted into a fight, then a riot, then a full battle. In the chaos, a knight led the crowd in an assault on the city's fortress. They seized food, killed around 4,000 Hungarians, and fled toward the Byzantine border before any army could respond. The Byzantine governor planned to ferry them across the Sava River slowly, under control, but the Crusaders had no patience. Instead, they attacked the very soldiers trying to help them. After defeating the Byzantine forces, they resumed their plundering, burning Belgrade, then marching on Niš, the regional capital. On the way out of Niš, a group of Germans burned a mill, and once again, everything exploded into violence. The Byzantine army had no choice but to intervene. Peter tried to negotiate, but by now, the crowd was completely out of control. They attacked the city of Niš itself. The first assault failed, but they returned in greater numbers. This time, the Byzantines launched a full counterattack. The result? A massacre. The peasant army was crushed. Peter fled into the hills. The Byzantine emperor eventually transported what remained of the Crusaders across the Bosphorus. And yet, the chaos did not end. They continued to loot and destroy. The bitter irony? This was once Byzantine land, the very territory the emperor had begged the Pope to help reclaim, now being ravaged by his own allies. At Nicomedia, the army split apart. The French followed Peter. The Germans and Italians followed Reynold. The two groups competed in plunder, each returning with stories of success, each growing more reckless than before. Powerless, Peter left. Meanwhile, the French attacked a Turkish town. Unable to breach its walls, they turned on civilians, committing atrocities so brutal that even children were thrown into the fire. The German force captured a fortress, but failed to secure water. There was none. Surrounded by Turkish forces, within days they were reduced to drinking donkey blood and their own urine. Then, they surrendered. They were given a choice: convert or die. Many chose death, but their leader, Reynold, chose to live, even offering to join the Turkish ranks. Then came the rumor that the Germans had captured the Turkish capital. Blinded by greed and hope, 20,000 Crusaders marched out to claim victory. They walked straight into a trap. In a narrow valley, arrows rained down from all sides. Turkish cavalry closed in. Out of 40,000 who had set out, only 3,000 survived.